The only success Jamestown found was within the crop of tobacco, and that was through the significant connection through the kidnapping and essentially holding and converting of Meteoka, which was Pocahontas. And they learned the art of drying tobacco from the natives, which just made crazy money in Europe and led to other investments in these colonies. Now, with these riches, most of them began in tobacco in the Carolinas, which is a study question. In the Carolinas, it was rice, and ultimately throughout the South became, as we all know, cotton. But every crop that they were finding to be successful and marketable was a labor intensive, including sugar, a labor intensive crop, which meant as demand grew, the amount of native land that had to be taken grew, the labor to work the land. So it's three modes of production, which is land, capital, and labor. So as demand, colonies, and capitalism grew, as did the need for labor. So that's the direct correlation between the role of forced labor in the developing early colonies. So they're bringing over as many indentured servants as possible. But the problem was, as happens in business and politics, they were giving all the land away to their friends. They weren't giving. So by the time somebody were to come to the New World, do their 7 years of indentured servitude, well, there's no good land to give, if any at all. So it became a problem that you had all of these disgruntled former indentured servants in the country, which was the basis of Nathaniel Bacon's army in his rebellion in 1776. And they had to find a way to stop these European peasants that had functioned the extent of their servitude. They said, "Well, okay, we don't want to give away land. We want to keep the land in the hands of the people we want to give land to, and we don't want a lot of expansion because too much expansion is messing up some of the treaties that they had with Native Americans for other resources. Again, capitalism. So if the poor people who were once indentured servants tried to expand into the Native American areas, they wouldn't let them do that. So again, if you have these people working off servitude, but I have to give you land at the end of this, that made them naturally turn to the African slave that you didn't have to give land to. And structurally, um, they got more work out of a people who were brought by force for the sole purpose of working in the dynamic of ownership and commodification, where these people, humanity was removed from these people. And that's what never happened in human history before. So many people say, oh, well, there was always slaves. Whites were slaves. Muslims were slaves. Africans were slaves. Middle Eastern was slaves. Chinese were slaves. No people in human history before or since were commodified, where their humanity was taken and it was hereditary. That has never happened before. Even from the southern Western Hemisphere and the northern Western Hemisphere, the Catholicism in the Caribbean and South America had less, had fewer characteristics of the Protestant chattel slavery system where all humanity was removed and complete commodification had formed. So that is why that shift in Virginia from indentured servitude to slavery began and obviously spread throughout all of the 13 colonies and what we would later know is the American South. Now, understand once the reason why northern colonies, though they were more founded on religion, um, their their lack of slavery was not a moral position. They had winters, so it doesn't make sense to be taking care of people all year round when you only have a short agricultural season. So a lot of their economy was built around um, the peripherals of slavery, slave ships, insurance, processing the textiles that were grown and assembled and harvested by slaves. But the entire 13 colonies had an economy of slavery. And it's important to understand the start of race based enslavement for several reasons. And it's not just labor, but Bacon's Rebellion as well. Um, During Bacon's Rebellion, for them re, to ensure, and this is in writing, for them to ensure that this rebellion would not happen again, the governors wrote to England and told them that they're going to divide and conquer the lower class. And until this point in America, everybody could vote. Um, Everybody could marry anybody. They were just poor. They had an equal chance at functioning as far as poor people were concerned. It was not until the resolution of Bacon's Rebellion that the concept of whiteness was introduced at all. For whites, for Europeans to be represented as a monolith did not exist before 1681. So this was the point in which whiteness was created. And they separated the privileges of the people in the lower class by culture and by ethnicity. So poor whites retained their rights to marry who they wanted, to protect who they want, to uh, uh, hold government offices at their level of society, to own land, to own guns, all those things they retained. That was removed from their counterparts of other races, which dropped the floor. They didn't elevate the poor whites, they just dropped the floor on the native and the people of African descent. And that system is what became the system of slavery, that became convict leasing, that became Jim Crow, that became Plessy versus Ferguson, segregation, that became Brown versus Board of Education anti segregation resistance that became the civil rights movement and civil rights resistance, that became Nixon's war on drugs, that became Ronald Reagan's war on drugs, that became Clinton's um, 1994 crime bill. All of these disproportionately affected Black people, the same group that came out of slavery, the same group that segregation disproportionately um, affected, that Jim Crow was made around. So all the way up until today, to Black Lives Matter, to violent policing or specific unique policing in the Black community, as it was done in the 60s with the police dogs and all of those things that is still going on today. The color coded um, identification as to where behavior is aligned with race when it comes to Black people. An example: Black on Black crime. If everyone else does crime in this country, only 12% of the nation, Black people, have their ethnicity connected to a behavior, as though criminality is a part of their genetic structure, which is done with no one else. So when we're talking about race based enslavement systems, these are the systems that still exist today. But we have to know where that they came out of this Bacon's Rebellion. That was where it didn't exist. Poor people were just treated as poor people. But when they banded together and the poor people that outnumbered the rich made a huge problem for the rich. And that was when we began to see race based dynamics come into play. Um, as far as some of the questions we need to be ready for, most enslaved people were taken from Western Africa. And the motivating factor in the creation of colonies such as Maryland, Connecticut, and Rhode Island was primarily religious. All of them were investments for money, but they had a unique separation from the Southern and Jamestown colonies, in that most of those people came specifically around some type of religious freedom. And in the Carolinas were unique as to where, when we're talking about crops that were being uh, that was the plantation structure that came about in these colonies, your original colonies, Virginia, had tobacco, but then your Carolinas had rice, and then the rest of your southern states began the cotton, and a few had sugar as well. And remember, Bacon's Rebellion, which I've gone after quite a bit, and King Philip's War, which was more in the north, um, it was in Massachusetts, happened at the same time, but it was always about conflict with natives. The poor whites who weren't given land as indentured servants, and just greedy people who wanted to expand their businesses, were trying to um, expand further into Native American land. It wasn't really conflict with Native Americans, but that's how the book is representing it. It was, all of these issues was the crown saying don't take more native land, and the colonists wanting to take more land, which is ultimately what the Revolutionary War was about. Not just the taxes, but the restrictions on growth, because these people wanted more. They were greedy and they didn't care what they had to do to get it. Um, the English survived the Yamsey War by developing an alliance with the Cherokee Nation. Now, this is a key that you want to remember, the Cherokee Nation.